Nicktoons Freeze Frame Frenzy was essentially a 2D Pokemon Snap that's pretty much been lost to time, which is kind of weird because you'd think a fusion of two of the most popular IPs in the world would have garnered a little bit more attention. So today we're going to be looking at the history of one of the strangest games I've ever seen. Before we dive into the gameplay of Freeze Frame, I want to take a second to explore the history of the photography genre itself because it's pretty interesting. A photography game is defined by Wikipedia. Okay, I couldn't find any other definitions, okay? I know my 8th grade English teacher is probably rolling in her grave right now. Maybe. I actually don't know if she's still alive or not. It's defined as a video game genre in which taking photographs using the in-game camera system is a key game mechanic, which is pretty self-explanatory. Actually, I guess you guys probably could have figured that out on your own. But to find the first photography game, we gotta take a trip all the way back to 1984.
A day in the life of a Commodore 64.
Nessie was released for the Commodore 64 as a type-in game, which at the risk of sounding like a massive nerd, I think it's really interesting. Well, actually, type-in games were super popular for the Commodore 64.
Earthquake. Yep, we're having an earthquake.
The Commodore 64, for those of you who've touched a woman before, is an 8-bit computer that was hugely popular. Like, the highest selling computer model of all time levels of popular. And a common medium for the games were type-in games. They had these game books that were filled with tons of different games. They didn't come on a disc like you might think. Instead, it had the actual code for the games. The Internet Archive has a lot of these magazines scanned in, so you can click through them and take a look at them. It's pretty cool. Let's say it's 1984. So what you would do is you would go line by line and type in the code that you see in the magazine, and you'd end up with a game. It's kind of like building Legos or paint by numbers, just with more migraines. Could you imagine painstakingly going line by line? Like, if you make a mistake, it's not like today when you're coding where you have IDEs, like you're not typing in Eclipse. It's not gonna tell you if you made a mistake. You have to go back line by line, comparing to the magazine back to the screen to see where you screwed up. But hey, after all your hard work, at least you can play this. Personally, as somebody with a computer science degree, I think the C64 is like really, really cool. So I'd like to eventually get one, and we could make some cool videos about it, I think. So maybe be on the lookout for some of those possibly in the future. But back to Nessie. The goal of the game is to try to get a clear photo of Nessie while avoiding the other sea creatures. I mean, obviously, it's pretty bare bones. It was 40 years ago. But if we skip ahead 8 years, we start fleshing out the genre a little bit with what I would have to assume Freeze Frame is based on. Gekibo Gekisha Boy was clearly the inspiration for Nicktoons Freeze Frame. It's an action photography game, so it adds in some obstacles for the players to avoid, but the main gameplay revolves around taking pictures of rare occurrences. It's a 2D side-scroller, and I mean, come on, look at it. It's the same game as Freeze Frame. It's clearly just a Nickelodeon reskin. I'm willing to bet, I mean, I'll put the house on it, that you guys have played or at least seen the Nicktoon Unite games back in the day. I remember thinking it was the coolest thing ever. Seeing all my favorite characters interacting in one game was so cool. It was like my Avengers. It blew my mind. But it turns out these weren't the first Nickelodeon crossover games, like myself and probably all of you guys thought. That honor, unfortunately, goes to Nicktoons Freeze Frame Frenzy. It was released in 2004 exclusively for the Game Boy Advance. Now, we don't get much background as far as the story goes, but the gist of it is that all the Nickelodeon worlds are merging and mixing together, and it's up to Jimmy to get everything back to normal by sending us out into these mixed up worlds to take some pictures. We can choose one of 6 characters, and we got all the heavy hitters here. We got Spongebob, Danny Phantom, Arnold, Tommy Pickles, Otto Rocket, and Timmy Turner. Each character has unique attributes to distinguish themselves from each other, which on paper should affect which characters you choose. In reality, it didn't really matter. I didn't notice much of a difference between characters. We have jump power, which controls how high you can jump, which you never really have to do. I'm pretty sure you can finish the game without jumping once. You can jump over enemies to avoid them, I guess, but the easier option is just to take a picture of them to get rid of them. Now, you want to talk about useless. Let's talk about the walking and running speed stats. they're completely useless. The game's entirely on rails, so it controls how fast you go anyways. It's not like you can run ahead or go backwards in a level. There's literally no point in having your speed up because you have to wait for the slow ass camera to follow you anyways. Endurance functions as your health. Maybe I'm just like unreal at this game, or maybe because I'm a 24-year-old playing a game that was made for toddlers, but I never really came anywhere close to dying, so endurance really didn't matter. Last is the flash gauge charging speed, which determines how fast your flash meter charges, which I didn't really find too useful, mostly because I'm not all too sure what it does. It does freeze enemies in place for a few moments. I don't know if that's the main use of it, but I didn't really notice a difference between characters anyways. And I mean, I appreciate them trying to make each character different, so you don't just pick your favorite character and then roll with them the entire game. But I think they really missed the mark here. Let's dive into the gameplay a little bit. The core gameplay dumps you into one of the characters' worlds with some main objectives, along with a point goal in mind. The objectives typically revolve around photographing characters that don't belong in that world, or capturing specific scenarios. These objectives give out massive bonuses when completed, moving you towards the point goal, which is what determines if you pass the level or not. So these main objectives are actually really, really important. The objectives are generally pretty easy to complete since you don't have a limited number of pictures. Like in other photography games like Pokemon Snap, you have a limited number of pictures you can take. In this game, not so much. So you can really go hog wild and spam the capture button until you pass the level. And unlike Pokemon Snap, where you take your 20 favorite pictures and submit them after the level to be created for points, you get points while you're taking pictures, and it's all a flat number. So even if the characters are doing something wacky and crazy and you take a picture catching them doing that, it doesn't do anything different. You don't get any bonuses. So it kind of reinforces that spamming the picture button is the best way to finish levels. If I'm being honest, the gameplay gets pretty old pretty fast. The game attempts to keep things fresh with boss battles at the end of each world, but they kind of screwed up. All the bosses are defeated in the same way. You just take a picture to stun them, and then take another picture to do some damage. It's all extremely simple, and I never ran into a situation, even with the boss fights, where failing the level even seemed like it was a possibility. And again, the difficulty's not scaled for a 24-year-old sexy gamer, and it's more for 8-year-olds, so take that how you will. So how does the game size up to the other games in the genre? Bad. It's just not fun. Let's take a look at Pokemon Snap, for example. Pretty much the same concept as Freeze Frame, and like I said, also made for kids. So what did Pokemon Snap do right? Obviously, we have the hardware. That makes a huge difference, right? Pokemon Snap was released on the N64, and the sequel released on the Switch. They had the advantage of being able to make their character models 3D, which was a big deal at the point the Pokemon Snap came out, because it was the first time people were able to see their favorite Pokemon in a 3D world, as well as being able to see them in their natural habitat, just kind of chilling, just hanging out. They're not trying to kill each other. It was really cool. It just, the world felt so alive, and getting to see them interact with each other and the environment, it was kind of like you were watching like a nature documentary. It was really wholesome, and in my opinion, that's what made the game really, really great. Now, compare that to Freeze Frame. It feels like everything's just thrown in without a whole lot of thought. I don't know. I just think these photography games work a little bit better when you're taking pictures of like animals and like creatures and stuff like that, instead of, Crocker. It does look like a 3D Freeze Frame Frenzy game was in development for the PS2. You can find the unreleased test footage of it on YouTube. And let me just say this right now. I would have done some absolutely heinous things for this to come out. From what I can tell in the footage, it was closer to like a GTA open world type game than it was the Pokemon Snap. Just thinking about being able to free roam in Bikini Bottom or Dimsdale in like a 3D open world game makes me want to drool everywhere. How fun would it be to explore these iconic locations that we've been watching since we were kids? Like, imagine being able to go in and see where landmarks are in the show in relation to each other. I want to be able to go walk from SpongeBob's Pineapple to the Krusty Krab and see what that walk's like and how long it takes to get there, and see where everything's at. It's just really, really sad that we could have had something like that, and we ended up with this. But with that being said, I do think it's a pretty cool piece of gaming history. Maybe more so for a collection than to play, but it's still, you know, pretty interesting. I love interesting stuff. You love interesting stuff, probably. If you're into that kind of thing, if you like, you know, cool, interesting, nostalgic stuff, go look at my last video. We talked about cool math games. I know you're playing Papa's Pizzeria during school, you filthy liar. So go take a trip down memory lane. Go check out that video. That's all I got for you guys today. We'll see you next time.